Hello, and thank you for joining us for CBM Calling today. Today, we're having a very somber conversation about the current state of race relations in the United States. We have all watched this week as people around the world have been reacting to police brutality and racism that is suffered by African Americans. And there have been protests and riots that have been taking place all over the globe in all major cities, including some of our own here in Canada, in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and also to protest the killing of George Floyd. Today, I'm joined by TaNikka Sheppard, who is the president of the Baptist Women of North America and the communications director at New Salem Baptist Church. TaNikka is joining us today from Columbus, Ohio. And I'm also joined by Mitch Randall, who is the executive director and editor of ethicsdaily.com. Mitch is joining us from Oklahoma City, where he is based. Before we begin our conversation, I think we need to say that racism is not an American problem. We actually have 2 shows planned for next week about racism in Canada. So we want to make sure that we are not implying that this is a problem that is only plaguing our neighbors to the south, but this is an issue that is faced by people everywhere in our world. And so I want to say thanks to TaNikka and to Mitch for joining me today, because I know this is a difficult topic to talk about, and it's probably very painful as well. So I'm very grateful that you're willing to spend the time to help us to understand more about what is currently happening in the US. So first of all, I want to say hi. And I wish these were happier circumstances that we were having a conversation, but I'm really looking forward to hearing your insight into this. So maybe I'll start with you, TaNikka. There's been a very long and painful history of incidents of police brutality toward African Americans that have happened in the past. I mean, we could list the names of people, men and women, that we have seen video clips of, we've read about incidents. What do you think is the difference right now? Why do you think, I think George Floyd in particular, why do you think in particular this incident has been the catalyst for what is the response that is currently happening now?
Well, I would name that there isn't just George Floyd, but there's been a series of recent events that have caused this to be, I would say, maybe a tipping point. But if you go back a few weeks ago to Ahmaud Arbery, a couple of weeks ago to Breonna Taylor, and I definitely don't want to leave out the name and cannot leave out the name of those 2 people. There's incidents in Central Park. And so there is this ongoing piece, but I believe what, and I want to name that all of this is happening inside of a pandemic where African Americans are already disproportionately dying inside of the United States from COVID-19. And so all of this is the pandemic inside of the pandemic. But what made it, I think, something that people could not ignore was the fact that we are watching a man be murdered right in front of our eyes. And I also want to name something else. And so I think that it became a tipping point. But the reason I say a tipping point is because the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements alongside of them have not stopped working. They've just not been in mainstream media. But the reason people have been able to get equipped and move what seems like so quickly is because those movements have not stopped working and have not stopped crying out for justice. But when you look at a man crying for his life, crying for his mother, saying he cannot breathe, he represents so many people who have been taken into police custody and whose lives have been snuffed out, and no one has been able to get justice for those persons. Those are 3 people. I live in Columbus, Ohio. Those are 3 names that are not from Columbus, Ohio, but even here marches are going on because we have our own list of names of African Americans who have died in police custody or who have been shot and killed or so on and so on, that people are, just like I said, and this has been a tipping point. And I, before I end, I also want to say that at this time, it is difficult because there has never been a point in American history where there has been true justice in our systems for African Americans. We can't go back to anything because there has never been a time when we trace the history of Black people in America where the justice system has been equitably distributed and given to us. So I just want to point that out, that there's always been an issue between African Americans and the police or any of those systems.
Yes, that racism is not just societal behaviors, it's embedded into all of our systems, right? It's a systemic issue that is much deeper than just individual behaviors, for sure. Thank you for pointing that out. You know, Mitch, I was reading an article that you wrote for Ethics Daily called When I Can't Breathe, When Will I Can't Breathe Transform into We Can't Breathe, in which you highlighted that when injustice is met with silence, that or inaction, we're actually endorsing that behavior. And I think there's been a lot of criticism of the church that the church has been way too silent on this issue. And that's going all the way back to the civil rights movement, that the church has really failed to speak out on this issue. Are you seeing more churches and church leaders speaking out right now?
Jennifer, first of all, thank you for inviting me on the program. It's a delight to be with you today. Let me be really specific on what I meant when I wrote those words in that article. Let's not mince words. The Black church has been speaking out for a long time. They have been crying out of their pain for a long time. Mainly when I suggest the silence of the church, it is the predominantly white church that has been silent. Now, there have been voices throughout history that we know of who have stood up for justice and racial justice and to denounce white supremacy in all of its form, both overt racism and systemic racism. But a majority of the white church has remained silent or turned the other way when our Black brothers and sisters in America have suffered at the hands of injustice. So what I tried to convey in that particular article is, yes, it is a condemnation of the white church in America that has for too long, in my opinion, been silent on these matters. Now, as TaNikka so eloquently illustrated a moment ago, this does seem to be a tipping point. And yes, we are hearing more and more voices, not only Black voices and white voices, but brown voices, voices from all around the world joining in this chorus, crying out for justice. Because TaNikka was exactly right. We saw a man murdered on the streets of the United States at the hands of police officials. And not only that, I want to make it perfectly clear. We have not seen justice. All we have seen is the indictment of 4 officers, and it took a little while to get to that point. There's been no conviction. And in America, what we have seen is we have seen indictments before throughout our history. But when it comes to the actual trial and the conviction of officers, when it comes to the slaying of African Americans in particular, we have not seen justice at all. A lot of times these end in acquittals. And I pray that that is not the case in this instance. But yes, we have seen this beautiful kaleidoscope of voices sounding out across the world, demanding for justice, not just based upon a legal issue, but a divine issue. This is a human being made in the image of God and is valued to God and therefore valued for each and every one of us. And how dare someone take out their life?
I think in particular, his last words calling to his mother, that I think just broke the heart of every mother, including myself, because that could be anybody's son. And I think that just catalyzed something. It brought something together for sure for a lot of us. TaNikka, what would you say to people who say that any talk about race is divisive? So you know the people, and I know people in my own life, I have to admit, some of them I've had to unfriend those people who say, when you say Black Lives Matter, they will say, well, all lives matter. And we're like, of course, all lives matter. Well, that is implied that all lives matter. And we know that we're all created in God's image. But why is it particularly important to acknowledge that Black lives matter right now in this time?
Well, because I always go back to move forward. And so since the beginning of this nation, when it was ruled by our government during the time of slavery, that that Black people were not even fully human. We were not even counted as full human beings, 3/5, I believe, of a human being, and that was depending on like your color and, and what drop of blood, how much the drops of blood that you had of African descent in you. And so we who descend from our ancestors, it becomes an extremely offensive remark at this point for me personally when people say all lives matter. It is either delusional or a way of just getting away from the topic. When one of the biggest, and I go back to living in Columbus, Ohio, one of the biggest races that we have here is a 5K race called Race for the Cure. And it is the Susan B. Komen Race for the Cure for Breast Cancer Awareness. And I don't remember anybody showing up to that race with picket signs saying, but what about brain cancer? Doesn't it matter? But what about, pancreatic cancer? Doesn't it matter? Those lives matter too. No, because we get that in this moment, this is the issue that we are addressing. I also think at this point, it is used by white supremacists, not just those who wear the white, capes and the skinheads, but it is used by people who want to maintain these standards of power and authority in our land, and who there are many Caucasian people who need to be a part of a narrative. And so because they need and can't be left out of the narrative, they need to say all lives matter. Nobody's discounting the rest of the lives. But because we have a heritage in this country of white supremacy, of the oppression of African American people, that is a mark of affirmation to people who need to be told your lives matter. And it is a statement of resistance against oppression. It is a statement of resistance against both the spiritual and the racial oppression that wants to snuff out African American lives. And I think I love it because it was a movement created by young people to affirm their voice and their life that can be snuffed out, as we saw in a matter of moments. And I do want to say one of the other tragic things about what happened on that street was that he literally was given a death penalty for a $20 bill. For a small incident. And so it's a matter of standing up and saying, you know what, our lives matter, because and I keep going back, since the entrance of this nation, since African Americans have been in what has become the United States, our lives have not mattered to most people, to the majority of the people. And we're not saying that statement doesn't mean no one else's lives matter or our lives are the only ones that matter. But what it means is we are created in the image of God, and that matters. And we matter to God, and our lives should matter to everyone else.
Absolutely. That's a great explanation of that. Mitch, do you think there can actually be genuine reconciliation or working together toward healing if we don't address the broken systems that exist? As TaNikka said, there is racism embedded into the very fabric of our societies. And do you think that comes from, we have not sought genuine repentance from the fact that our countries were founded on injustice and the lives of stolen people? And stolen land of Indigenous brothers and sisters, of African American brothers and sisters. Do you think that what we're seeing now is it's showing that we have never really addressed that sin on which our countries were founded?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, let's not make any mistake about the reality of the founding of the United States of America, as well as our North American brothers and sisters. This country was built upon white supremacy. That's a fact.
Mhm.
When the Europeans came over to North America, the first thing they did was to institute an attempted genocide of the indigenous people. Myself, I am a Muskogee Creek, part of one of the 5 civilized tribes that was displaced in the Southeast, and my ancestors walked the Trail of Tears. After the institution of a genocide in North America, the slave trade began, and it was, there's just no doubting the fact that North America was built upon white supremacy, that brown and black human beings were subordinate to the white class. And it's just that's the way our country was founded. And therefore, it is no surprise that the systems and institutions that were created under that ideology, and I also want to remind you, under that theology, that systemic racism is prevalent in North America, in particular the United States. When you see the statistics of mass incarceration, when you see the statistics of how much more likely an African American male in this country will die at the hands of a police rather than a white young male, it is horrifying. And it is just asinine to think that it is not a pandemic of systemic racism that we face here in the United States. Now, is there hope? I believe there is hope. It is going to take a lot of work. It is going to take a lot of willingness, not only on the part of the citizens of this country, but on the institutions of this country to make large strides and pass legislation. But also, the way to do that is to change the hearts and minds of people that are sitting in our churches. And that begins from the pulpit. We need bold proclaimers of the faith to stand in those pulpits and denounce racism, to denounce systemic racism, and call for change. The church can be the hope for the future, but they have to stand up and vocalize and demand that change.
Thank you. TaNikka, I wonder, how is that change? How do you see that change happening? How do we work toward racial reconciliation? Mitch has pointed out the church has to lead the way on this.
The church does have to lead the way.
Yeah.
And the church has to start by acknowledging the sin that is racism. And it also, which then goes into acknowledging the sin that is the racial construct and race as we see it. Because race as it is set up and understood today, it's not just that person is Black or that person is white. It is that whiteness is purity. And other things are other things. Everyone else is otherness. And until we deal with the sin that cause whiteness, purity, and everything else almost as tainted, then we can move forward. We can move forward. One of the scriptures I've been meditating on of late is Matthew, I believe it is 3:8, I believe. And it talks about the bear fruit that befits your repentance. And so we want to act with people who are feeling bad right now. It's not enough to feel bad. It's not enough to just be sorry and feel sorry. There needs to be fruit out of that. And part of that fruit deals with power constructs. Part of that fruit deals with a shifting of privilege. We can't have racial reconciliation, and churches continue to stand behind political rhetoric that allows for a president, and I'm going to say it, to do and say whatever they want, including tear gassing people who are protesting peacefully in order to move them, and then take a picture in front of a church he's not authorized to be at with a Bible that we know he doesn't read. And so that is that type of thing. And you have people of God, and that as a signal to the people of God who don't require anything more. That is a problem, that there are people of God who are standing up saying, good job to that. That is painful right now. And those same people will support him in November. And so when we talk about, racial reconciliation, like I said, we got to deal with the sin of race, and we got to deal with the sin that has become inequitable privilege, and the sin that continues to allow people to be killed and not matter. I go back always because I'm a history buff. At times I love history. And even when you think about the slave trade, when you think about on the coast of Africa, those are churches built on top of the in the slave by those slave quarters. On those ships, people had church while those slaves were underneath the ships. When they came, the slave owners always went to church. I say these things because we have to be willing to deconstruct our theology and to allow it to be reconstructed by God and by a willingness to open our eyes. And it is painful when other people, I talk to atheists, I've had some great conversations with atheists over the last week, who are like, that's the reason I don't want your Jesus, because your Jesus is hateful. Look at that. If that's what you represent. And I'm able to stand up and say that is not. That's not what God represents. But we do need a counter narrative, and we need more people in churches that consistently standing up.
Well, I'm going to ask a final question for both of you, which is, we bear quite a burden in that we're Baptists, and we have a legacy, I think, that we have to live up to. I think we always think of Dr. King and his legacy, the impact that he made on this world, and he led the way. And I think, as a Baptist pastor, I think what is our unique contribution as Baptists, I think, into all these conversations? I'll open that up to either one of you to answer, or both.
Well, Baptists do have a long history of being advocates for justice, but they've also got a long history of being advocates on the wrong side of history as well. And so it is a tenuous history that we come into. Think about the South, especially the Southern Baptist Convention and its formation. Now, they've made great strides in some areas, not so much. But overall, we do have a history of having advocates speak out. You mentioned the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement could have never happened without Black leadership coming from the church, and particularly the Baptist Church. There's just no disputing that fact. We have seen it in other parts of the history as well, with abolitionists speaking out from time to time. We've seen it more recently with Baptists calling for ecological justice, and other voices joining this myriad, calling out in the spirit of Amos. So we do have a history of it. But we need to make certain that we continue to speak out consistently, and not only consistently, but make certain that the right voices are being heard. Another sin of the white church is to speak over our Black and brown brothers and sisters when it comes to these particular important moments. And so the voices I am listening to now are the voices that have experience the pain of police brutality and white supremacy, because they are speaking from passion and clarity and with an authenticity that I cannot speak out of. So we do have a long history, and it's exciting to see a new generation of Baptist leaders such as TaNikka speaking out for justice issues.
For sure. TaNikka?
Thank you. I want to say, if I didn't say it before, thank you for having me, because I was so passionate at the beginning. But thank you again for this opportunity. I would end by saying two things. I think the first is I encourage everybody, so there's three. I encourage everyone to read about the history of the Progressive Baptist movement, and why it had to emerge as a support for Dr. King. I encourage everyone to do that, because it shows that even within churches, and you know, history is revisionist a lot of times, and so everybody wants to believe that they marched beside Dr. King. No, he had battles going on within and without, and
Sure.
so I encourage everyone to read the history of V.O. Booth, Dr. V.O. Booth, and the others who surrounded him and supported him during that time. I think the other thing is to, one of the things that pains me a lot of times is people don't listen to the young voices that are crying out. And I call them the young prophets in the street right now. And I wish that church leaders would support the young prophets in the street and would follow their lead, just like they want the young people to follow them in the churches. I continue to ask church leaders to follow the young prophets in the streets. And we would be amazed at what would happen. And then the last thing is to just continue to do the work when the TV shuts off, when the news station stops saying this is important, when the people go home. We should not be satisfied. According to the tenets of the Baptist faith, there is a priesthood of all believers. And until all believers are seen and treated as priests, that includes young, old, men and women and so on, then we should not be satisfied that we are living up to what God has called us to be. So once again, I just ask that. There's so much I could say, but those three things are really important to me at this time.
Thank you so much. Very wise words. I want to thank you both so much. Just such insight from both of you. I've really appreciated what you've shared with us today. I want to just let people know that there is a statement that has been released by CBM on anti-Black racism. We have put that up on our website, so please check that out. It's on our website, cbmin.org. And I do encourage you to look up ethicsdaily.com. I love what you guys do, Mitch. I'm not saying that just because you're on, but I love the thoughtful way in which you engage issues.
Thank you very much.
And it really is leading the way, I think, for Baptists to be able to think in a way that is global, has a global perspective, but yet I think it's just so thoughtful, so well-grounded theologically as well. So thank you for what you do there. I want to let people know that on Monday, CBM Calling will be back. We'll be having Tim and Kelly Hutton on talking about our COVID-19 response in Bolivia. So thank you all and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, TaNikka and Mitch, once again.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much.
Take care.